Hello, good evening. Our topics tonight. The Israel-Hamas ceasefire enters a critical phase with a new detainee exchange. 3 Israeli detainees for 90 Palestinian detainees, marking the 4th swap round under the truce. Mediated by Egypt and Qatar, this exchange is pivotal for ceasefire negotiations and Gaza's political landscape. Meanwhile, 5 years after Brexit, the UK faces economic and political shifts. Trade, labour markets and investment have changed, while British politics has moved beyond traditional left-right divisions. As the UK adapts, what is the true impact of its EU departure? Let's get in focus. A new prisoner swap under the Israel-Hamas ceasefire will see 3 Israeli detainees exchanged for 90 Palestinian prisoners. Facilitated by Egypt and Qatar, the deal aims to extend the truce and reduce tensions. But Hamas's demands for an Israeli military withdrawal and political divisions in Israel complicate negotiations. Before diving deeper, let's examine how this exchange is being reported. According to reports, Israel will release 90 Palestinian detainees as part of this 4th swap round. Among them, 9 individuals are serving life sentences, while 81 have long-term sentences. Hamas has framed these swaps as part of the larger Al-Aqsa flood prisoner exchange, while Israeli officials remain cautious, emphasizing that they will assess the security implications of each deal. This latest exchange raises critical questions. Will these swaps help sustain the ceasefire, or do they risk deepening political divisions and further negotiation deadlocks? How the situation is being reported now. We are joined here on Qnews by Mohammed Azaldin, the managing editor of Ahram newspaper. Thank you very much for being here with us. Now, this exchange marks the 4th round of swaps under the ceasefire agreement. What impact do these swaps have on both sides?
Of course, any continuation of the ceasefire agreement items in any of the phases and implementing it as planned is positive. This cannot be denied, despite of the political Israeli violations or the attacks launched on Palestinians in the West Bank. It is a positive thing, and it did not come from nowhere. There is a tireless follow-up for 24/7 by the mediation committee. The Egyptian role is really big in this, and solving a lot of matters that could have hindered the rounds of swaps during the past few days. There is a lot of attention and determination to continue all the items of the ceasefire agreement and the hostage and detainees exchange, solving obstacles and returning Israeli hostages to Israel safely. There is also a lot of work exerted in preparation for the 4th round of exchange tomorrow, and as well as opening the Rafah crossing early from the Palestinian side under the supervision of the European Union Committee in addition to Palestinian staff from the customs and the security side, of course, related to Egypt in consultation with the European forces and as well as the occupation side. The early opening of the crossing to receive the injured Palestinians is an evidence that Egypt is taking a lot of attention to alleviate the suffering of Palestinian people, especially that there is a call from the UN Secretary to send hundreds of injured Palestinians to receive treatment in Egyptian hospitals in Arish, Cairo, and Mansoura governorates, in addition to resuming the humanitarian aid access through the Rafah crossing or Karm Abu Salim or Lauga in accordance with the ceasefire agreement items.
Mr. Eldin, Hamas has linked future releases to an Israeli military withdrawal from Gaza, while on the other hand you have Israel insisting on eliminating Hamas's military presence. How do you see this being resolved, and how does this fundamental disagreement shape the future of the ceasefire?
Of course, the second phase won't be easy or smooth, and there is a reluctance from the Israeli side and the far right, supported by Netanyahu, the Prime Minister. In addition to the Palestinian resistance scenes when exchange the hostages, which provokes the Israeli and makes them feel the failure, and they are already failing as they couldn't return any of the Israeli hostages alive by force. And there are also international pressures on the occupation to commit to the exchange items and commitments. We cannot depend on mere statements, but we are dealing with the reality on the ground. The reality here, in spite of violations from the Israeli side and the maneuvers, but the handover and the exchange rounds are being implemented as planned, and we have seen the Rafah crossing being reoperated recently, transporting in the injured from the Palestinian side to Egypt as planned. We are only seeing these media statements from the Israeli side, but on the ground, in reality, we can see the Israeli side stalling to implement the ceasefire as planned, but so far the items is being implemented in spite of the stallation. And there is a huge important role played by Egypt to convince all parties to commit to the ceasefire agreement, to preserve the lives of the Palestinian population and getting life back to the Gaza Strip, ensuring lasting access of humanitarian aid, and rejecting any attempts to the relocation of the Palestinian population, liquidating the Palestinian cause and preventing the threat to the Egyptian national security.
Now, the ceasefire agreement is currently set for 42 days for the first phase. Do you believe this truce will be extended, or do you think we are likely to see a breakdown in negotiations?
There will be a difficulty and obstacles to implement the second and third phases, but we are hopeful that the voice of reason prevails during the upcoming period, especially that apparently there are side agreements with the far right and the US administration to resume the genocide of the Palestinians unless the Israeli hostages are returned. We're hopeful that the voice of reason and wisdom prevails during the upcoming days because they are very critical to go smoothly in peace for the success of the agreement. Otherwise, and it is pivotal that the Palestinian resistance side stops the scenes of victory and celebrations, provoking the Israeli forces.
And I just wanted to bring in the humanitarian crisis before we finish. We're looking at now 47,400 casualties reported. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza remains severe. How do these swaps help to calm things on the ground and stabilize conditions for civilians and perhaps even help with aid getting through?
Of course, what is happening of swap rounds and returning the Israeli hostages and receiving Palestinian detainees from the Israeli forces and allowing more humanitarian aid to be entered into Gaza from the Egyptian side to the Palestinian crossings. Of course, all of these are positive points, alleviating the suffering that the Palestinian population is going through, whether in the Gaza Strip or other places. We have seen during the past few days the volume of destruction that has been caused in the Gaza Strip, and we have also seen the celebrations of Gazans to go back to their homes, whether in southern Gaza or central Gaza, which is an evidence that the Palestinian people is determined to hold on to their cause and their territories and lands, not accepting any other solution.
Thank you indeed. That's Mohammed Ez al-Din. Thank you very much. We're just out of time, Mr. Ez al-Din, but thank you very much for joining us here on Q News. Now we turn to a different global issue. 5 years after Brexit, how has Britain's political and economic landscape evolved? 5 years after leaving the EU, Brexit has reshaped the UK's economy, investment and workforce, while also redefining political divisions beyond the traditional left-right split. As Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government seek to recalibrate ties with the EU, public scepticism grows over Brexit's impact. Before analysing the economic effects, let's examine how Brexit has shifted British party politics. According to the British Social Attitudes Report, Brexit has fundamentally changed political party alignments in the UK. Traditionally, party loyalty was based on a left-right ideological divide, but since Brexit, a new libertarian or authoritarian divide has emerged. For instance, in 2016, Conservative voters were 15% more likely to identify as authoritarian, while Labour voters leaned more towards libertarian views. By 2023, this divide had widened significantly, with Conservative support 27% higher among authoritarians and Labour support 26% higher among libertarians. This means that despite Brexit not being central to the 2024 election campaign, it has had a lasting impact on voter alignment, influencing views on immigration, social values and national identity. Now, with this in mind, let's now examine the broader economic consequences of Brexit. To discuss this, we are joined by Greg Swenson, the chairman of Republicans Overseas UK. Thanks for joining us here on Q News, Mr. Swenson. Now, 5 years after Brexit to this very day, The UK economy is 4% smaller than projected had it remained inside the EU. What would you say are the most significant economic consequences of Brexit, and has there been any positives?
Yeah, I imagine there are positives, but I think that many pro-Brexit voters are disappointed with what the government did after the Brexit vote, after the referendum, in that they didn't take advantage of the opportunity for tax reform and deregulation. So Brexit to many, even those in the Project Leave camp, was a disappointment because it wasn't executed, first of all, until Boris Johnson finally completed the exit from the EU in 2019, late 2019. But more importantly, the government that executed Brexit, the Conservatives, the Tories, they didn't take advantage of that opportunity, again, to go back to the kind of Thatcherite, Ronald Reagan supply side economics of tax reform and deregulation. Rather, they actually governed from the center left as opposed to the center right, with price caps and windfall taxes and other sort of, anti-growth policies that you'd normally associate with the left.
And trade barriers and regulatory changes have hit UK exports quite hard, haven't they? And which would you say are the industries that have been most affected? And are businesses in the UK adapting to this?
Well, I think there's big challenges, and I think the most obvious industry is energy. And the UK has gone from being energy independent in 2005 to completely dependent on imports. And the fracking ban, the ban on fracking natural gas, the ban on more additional or future leases in the North Sea for oil, those were all executed by the Conservatives, which is contrary to traditional supply side economics, which you would associate with the party of the right. And so, we found ourselves in a really difficult position where the party of the right was looking for tax increases. They were putting in windfall taxes on energy companies that made money and made, according to them, too much money. So we in the UK are completely dependent on energy sources from either France in terms of electricity, or Qatar, or the US in terms of natural gas. And I think that's, you could argue that's better than being dependent on the Russians for natural gas, but it's something that you would not expect from the party of the right. They continue to pay 5 times, this is crazy, 5 times. The businesses in the UK pay 5 times what American businesses pay for electricity, for power. They pay about 50% more than Germany, which is not exactly known as a place that's liberated the energy sector. So I think that's one of the examples of a sector that they could have taken advantage of leaving the European Union, and they did not. And they're actually in a more difficult position than many of the other EU members.
And of course, that was high prices and the economic situation on the ground was one of the reasons why some people wanted to leave the EU in the first place, thinking it would get better. Also, right. The other big issue is, of course, freedom of movement. This is the freedom for people who are EU citizens to live and work wherever in the EU. At the end, when Brexit happened, of course, that was the end of free movement. And it's led to labour shortages in healthcare, in agriculture, in logistics. How has this impacted the United Kingdom, would you say? And has it been a...
Well, I'd have to say it's been negative, but again, not because of just Brexit, leaving the EU. It's that they didn't implement policies that would liberate legal immigration. So instead of free movement, it would be immigration for sectors like healthcare that you mentioned, that where we need additional employment. So on one hand, we have employment challenges. On the other hand, we have illegal migrants coming in on boats. And that's been, something that again, the Tories were disappointing in terms of their handling, and that you can thank the Tories for the rise of the Reform Party, and done a great job in actually focusing on what the people are interested in. And so I think again, I think there's still an opportunity, but that opportunity was in 2016. They didn't take advantage of it. And now we are, 5 years later, or more than 5 years later, not really in any terribly different position than we were in 2016. So, it's 5 years since the actual Brexit, but it's really 9 years since the people voted to leave the EU.
And foreign investment, another negative I feel we might be going to. Maybe there will be a positive somewhere on this list, but I'm not quite sure there will be. Foreign investment in the UK has dropped significantly. What factors do you think have driven businesses to relocate? And has that ability to trade within the EU really made so many businesses leave the United Kingdom?
I would argue that it's not the inability to trade in the EU. I think the problem is that the energy costs are significantly higher here. That's very difficult for businesses. And why would investors invest in the UK when the taxes are too high? They were raised, if anything. If you make too much money, there's the threat of windfall taxes. Again, these are all things identified with parties of the left, in spite of the fact that the conservatives were in power for over a decade. What I would argue, I'm looking for some good news here. I would argue there is a real shift in momentum, in spite of the Labour government being in power, and there's really little chance of an election before 2029. However, the mood shift here is much more to the right and towards liberating the economy, lowering taxes. Again, I don't think that will happen because the Labour government is in power. But there is a real movement in the West in general and in the rest of Europe, toward a more populist, conservative economic agenda. And I think that's, you're seeing that in the polls, you're seeing that in what people want. And Europeans, especially here in the UK, are looking at what's happened in America with President Trump winning the election and all of the first 2 weeks of the administration as a real positive economic message. And I think many would like to replicate that. And you're seeing parties all over the world trying to replicate that common sense revolution of tax reform and deregulation. I think it could work here in the UK. I wish they had done it back in 2016 and then again in 19 when they had the opportunity. But they failed to do that. I think there's hope, and I think the sentiment is really changing.
I think you're right. I don't disagree that the UK electorate has moved to the right, but then we see other polls on Brexit specifically saying that public sentiment on Brexit has shifted and that 55% of Britons now believe leaving the EU was a mistake. However, the Labour government under Keir Starmer has said there's no chance of that happening, and there's no chance of rejoining the single market either. Do you think that was a mistake, or do you think, since you say that it's probably not going to happen, that we're going to have lower taxes in the UK any time soon? Was it a mistake not to open things up and to cut off the chance of joining the single market?
Look, they were in the single market for a long time, so I don't think that, we can kind of turn the clock back. I think many were disappointed. So you have your Remainers, and, the people that voted to remain are probably very disappointed that they lost the referendum. But then you have a lot of many people that voted to leave, voted for Brexit, and are disappointed in the lack of execution and the lack of taking advantage of this opportunity. So that's why I think Brexit polls pretty low. And even some conservatives prior to the referendum vote were very skeptical about the government at the time, the David Cameron government. They were skeptical about their ability to embrace Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and go back to deregulation and lower taxes. And now you have a situation where it's the worst of both. They're no longer in the single market, but they haven't really taken advantage and gone back to the sort of traditional supply side economics. So for many, it's the worst of both. But again, I think that sentiment is changing. You could see a new government in 2029, that will actually take advantage of Brexit and not being tied by their regulations.
Okay, let me just ask you one quick final question.
Sure.
What does the future hold for the UK's economy? Is it going to get better in this Parliament or in in 2025? And if you could be brief, we only have about a minute left.
Okay. I do not think it will get better soon. And I think that you've seen labor pivot a little bit toward deregulation. You saw that in many of the comments from the government this week, from Rachel and Keir. There is a pivot toward deregulation, but I don't think it will be enough. They are still somewhat connected to net zero. And until they drop that, I don't think there's a hope for an economic revival here in the UK.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have you on the program, Mr. Swenson. Thank you for your analysis. 5 years after Brexit, the UK faces a weaker economy, political realignment and ongoing debates over its relationship with Europe. While the UK government seeks to stabilise trade relations, the economic and social consequences of Brexit continue to shape Britain's future. The detainee exchange, meanwhile, in Gaza marks another pivotal moment in the ceasefire agreement, but sustaining negotiations remains a challenge as both sides remain at odds. Meanwhile, in the UK, Brexit's economic impact and political shifts continue to reshape the national discourse. Thank you for joining us here on In Focus. I'm Mark Summers. See you next time.